Which one matters more when it comes to deciding to buy a new TTRPG? Aesthetics or mechanics? So, this is a conversation that I've had with a few people, and one that always bounces around in my head every time that I think about it is aesthetics versus mechanics. I've had people online tell me that aesthetics don't make a TTRPG. Aesthetics shouldn't be the only reason that you buy a TTRPG, and so forth. And I've never seen an argument for the other way around, that mechanics shouldn't be the only reason you buy a TTRPG, which I think is kind of interesting. But let's kind of talk about that. And before we get into this, I want to clarify what I mean by aesthetics. When I am talking about aesthetics when it comes to a TTRPG, I am talking about the vibe of the game. I'm talking about the artwork, the story that it promises to tell. And what I mean by that is when you get a game, a lot of the time they will tell you what kind of story it's for. So for example, D&D is a game that is perfect for fantasy zero to hero type stories, where you start off as someone who's very weak, taking on just like simple quests and stuff like that, to then going on usually massive adventures and journeys and all of that you end up killing dragons or gods and things like that. It is that adventure story, it's that raising in power and all of that. That is the type of experience that D&D promises in like a fantasy world and all of that. That is partially what I look for in aesthetics, is what does the game promise me the experience is going to be? What does this game tell me it's going to be like? What does this game tell me what the vibe is going to be like? That is something that I consider for aesthetics. So not only is it just like the overall look of the game, which I think can play a very strong part of TTRPG aesthetics, because we're visual creatures. We like when things look nice, and when we see something that has very specific vibes, we tend to be attracted to that. But aesthetics is also what the game promises you, the types of stories that it promises you, the types of characters it promises you that you can play and stuff like that. I also think that the writing of the game is part of the aesthetics. For example, I tend to read a lot of TTRPGs. I have all these games on my shelf back here, and I have read more than I have played out of all of these. When I read a game, and it takes me through the mechanics in a way that always answers my questions, and that always lets me start to imagine and think about, the possible stories and possible characters and stuff that I can play in this game. I think that's part of the aesthetics, because there is more intention behind that writing, and there's more oomph behind that writing that helps build upon the game in the more mechanical and crunchier aspects of it. And so I think, the overall vibe of a game, how it's read, I'm going to call that the vibe. The vibe of the game, the way that it presents itself, the way that it tells you about the mechanics, and the ways that it gives you examples and stuff like that, I think is the overall vibe. So that, combined with the way that it presents itself, when it comes to the way it introduces itself, and also, its artwork, I think are all part of the aesthetic of a TTRPG. That is all the aesthetic of a TTRPG, in my opinion. And an example of a more aesthetic TTRPG that I can give right now is Merkborg. I think this is like the most popular example. It literally describes itself as being rules light and heavy everything else. The cover makes a statement when you see it. When you read through the book, it is an experience to read through. It's got all these bright colors and black ink, and it's like, it makes a statement. And the way that it's written too, brings you through this doom and gloom, just like oppressive fantasy world. You don't think about surviving long in this world. It doesn't give you that vibe at all when you read it. It sets itself up very strongly. And I think this is a great example of a very aesthetic heavy TTRPG. Now, let's talk about mechanics. What do I mean when I'm talking about mechanics? And I think this one's a little bit more straightforward. It's talking about the rules. It's talking about the system that the game is built on. It's talking about the support it may give to the players and the GM, whoever's running it, all of that. And, the actual, like, rules of the game. And I love reading through TTRPG mechanics. I think it's so fun. And I think that mechanics are a very important part of TTRPGs. However, just having a very mechanic game, I don't feel like is always the most attractive. For example, there are quite a few games out there that are like genre agnostic systems. And basically, they don't promise a certain experience when you play through the game. What they promise you is a set of rules, a system to play basically any story that you may want to play in this system. And a good example that I have is Fate. Fate and Cypher, and there's a few other ones that are out there. The basic roleplay system or something like that is another one. Those are all systems. Like, this is a system book here. It doesn't tell you what type of story to expect. It doesn't tell you the type of characters that you're going to play. It doesn't give you a vibe of the game that you're going to play, because this is to give you a system to then play anything that you want out of it. Now, I think that these types of systems are really fun. Now, I will say that as someone who reads TTRPG books and uses the aesthetics of a TTRPG book and the aesthetics that it gives you as a way to really get into a TTRPG, they tend to be some of the most boring ones, in my opinion. And I think that it tends to also have its issues if you are making a more general system TTRPG. It tends to be harder to market. It tends to be harder to really get recognition, unless you're a larger company, because, again, there's not a lot of vibe here to really like sell it on. Instead, you're trying to sell it mostly on mechanics, which a lot of people do enjoy, but I think it tends to be a harder sell because, as people, we're visual creatures. We love to see something that we find interesting. So Morkborg calls to a lot of people just to how it's visually done. A lot of the games that I have back here, for example, Vaesen, that's one that very visually appealed to me and made me buy it before I really knew what the system was. And I think a lot of people look at TTRPGs through that lens, of the more aesthetic lens. So I believe that aesthetics are just as important, if not more important, to TTRPGs than the mechanics. Because if you don't bring me in with the aesthetics of the game and a vibe of the game and a promise of the game, then I have a much harder time wanting to make the commitment to get that game. And this is definitely coming from my own personal experience and my own personal opinions on what I value in TTRPGs. I know there's a lot of people out there that look at mechanics first and look at the mechanics in the systems that a TTRPG offers before the aesthetics of it, because that matters to them more. However, I would say that the more general audience of TTRPGs probably value the vibes more than the mechanics. And I would also be on that fence, even though I love mechanics. I think that mechanics are one of the more fun things to read in a TTRPG, especially when they mesh with the vibes. But that's because it has to mesh with the vibes. Like, there needs to be a good foundation of an aesthetic and a game there to then really let the mechanics shine, in my opinion. So there have been a lot of games, like Vaesen, I think, is a really good one, where the mechanics just felt like it fit with the game. Apocalypse Keys is a fantastic example, in my opinion, of a game where the mechanics just fit the vibes and aesthetics of the game so well. It's a game about playing as these like powerful monsters, and you're tasked with basically trying to save the world and keep the apocalypse from happening, basically. But you're basically on that edge of becoming a monster that can cause the apocalypse yourself. You always have this battle between like being human and wanting to relate to people and express your emotions, but also having this monster side of you that wants to come out, and the darkness. And it's just a beautiful game. And I feel like the aesthetics hit so hard into these themes. And it makes it such a fun experience to read. And I can imagine, I haven't been able to play it yet, but I can imagine it makes it also just such a great experience to play. because the mechanics fit in with those themes so well. And games that I have found that I've struggled with getting into have a curse of the mechanics don't always fit into the themes of it. So, for example, a game that I have struggled getting into is Root. It's a game by Magpie Games. I like some of their other games, like Masks: A New Generation. I love it. It's such a great game. But Root, I've always struggled with because it promises such strong vibes. Let me show it off here. It is a game of playing as these cute little woodland creatures, as this vagabond adventure, kind of war game. Like, there's all types of factions and different sides and all of that. Like, there's a lot going on. And it has pretty strong vibes. Especially, like, if you look at this artwork, this looks very cute, very adorable. If you look through the book, it's the same thing. Very, very strong vibes, visually. However, I find that it really misses the mark when it comes to the mechanics. While you could look at the mechanics and say, like, yeah, these are good mechanics, they're robust, they make sense, you could play a game with them and it would be good. I find it really misses the mark because it doesn't feel like it makes sense with the vibe of the game. We have this, like, a little bit, it's not a lighthearted game, but a little bit darker game where you're playing as these woodland creatures and you've got these factions and you're dealing with that and you're vagabonds and all of that. That feels like a promise of something that might be a little bit lighter, especially with the theme of being like these little guys and creatures. However, the game feels kind of heavy. For example, when you start to read through the game, it introduces this faction tracking system pretty early on. And I have some experience with reading through like Blades in the Dark and some other games that use a lot of like faction mechanics and things like that. And there is a more rules light way to go about this, and not that a crunchy way of tracking faction relationships is bad, but when you are going in with a Powered by the Apocalypse game, which is what Root is, it uses the Powered by the Apocalypse system, which tends to be a more simplified system, you tend to expect more of the mechanics to fit within that theme. But then we go into like this faction tracking, and that's like your reputation and relationships between factions, and it is all of this. It is this really robust, complicated system that I've like read through, and like while I can like wrap my head around it, it's just kind of odd. Like, it doesn't feel like it really makes sense within the game and the themes and the vibes that the system promises and that the game itself promises, because it just feels like this clunky system in the middle of a more rules light game that I don't quite understand. And so, like, I feel like it's really important for aesthetics and mechanics to really like mix. And like, I say that aesthetics are really high when it comes to me looking at games, and that is true, but also it's really high when it comes to me wanting to play a game. It is so important for those two elements to actually work together. While aesthetics or mechanics can make me decide to pick a game that I want to buy, I feel like to actually be able to play it, they must work together. They must fit together in some way, or else I'm not going to be interested, because, it's easy to separate the two and be like, I care about aesthetics when it comes to a game, or I care about the mechanics when it comes to a game, but it all works together in this one system. It works together to bring this one thing to life. A TTRPG isn't just mechanics. It isn't just a system. It isn't just the aesthetics. It's all of that combined to then provide you an experience, to then provide you the foundation to play your own games in. And I think that's what's important. Like, yes, aesthetics are important, and yes, mechanics are important, and depending on who you are, they have their own varying importance. Both of them are important because both of them are what makes a game. Like, truly. And aesthetics can absolutely make a game. Just like mechanics and a system can make a game. That's why genre agnostic systems exist. That's why Fate exists. Because for some people, that's what makes the game for them. The way that the fate system works is what makes the game for them. And for some people, the way that Morkborg presents itself and the vibe that it gives off and just the very heavy doom and gloom heavy metal vibe is what makes the game for them. That the mechanics don't really matter as much. As long as they're easy enough to follow, cool. Yeah, I don't know. That's my thoughts on mechanics and aesthetics and all of that when it comes to TTRPGs. Both of them are important. Both of them are very important, especially for a lot of people, and for me included, both are important. Land of Eam got me to buy it because of the aesthetics. The promise of a game that is Muppets meets Lord of the Rings. That's what made me buy it. And then the mechanics that came along to support that game is what made me fall in love. Same thing with Vaesen, same thing with Monster of the Week, same thing with Stewpot. So many games I have fallen in love with because of the aesthetics off the bat. But the mechanics made it for me. And for a lot of people, it's a similar experience. And for some people, the aesthetics straight up make the game for them. And for other people, the mechanics make the game for them. So, I don't know. I think that's just great. Like, I think it's great that there's so many different things in the TTRPG space that people can play around with. You know, there's not just all aesthetic games in the space, because there are games that are more heavy in the rules and the mechanics and all of that and the systems. But there are also games that are lighter in those aspects and heavier in the vibes for the people who want that. So I just think it's great that there's options. And again, I don't think that one is more valuable than the other. I don't think if you value mechanics only, that makes you better than people who only value aesthetics. Because you're two different people. You want two different experiences from TTRPGs, and that's okay. And I think that's great. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Which one matters more when it comes to like getting a TTRPG, aesthetics or mechanics? Both. Depends on who you are. Yeah. If you enjoyed this video, I talk about TTRPGs. I really love TTRPGs. I'm obsessed with them a little too much, that I don't even really play them very often right now because I don't have a group, but I still read the books because I find it fun. So if you like that and you like my vibe of videos and all of that, feel free to subscribe. But this is the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'd love to hear what you think about when it comes to aesthetics versus mechanics. And if you are also in the same boat that like both of them matter just as much and like both should be in a game for it to really be like good. But yeah, so this is the end of the video. Let me know what you think, and bye.